It's my pleasure to introduce David Clark, who will be presenting the Psychology Seniors Honors Colloquium research project here this morning. David is from Seward, Nebraska, graduating from Seward High School in 2020. David is double majoring in psychology and sociology, and will be graduating this year after finishing up some coursework in the summer. While at Wayne, David has been involved in Psych-I, the International Honor Society in Psychology, being elected their vice president. He has also been inducted into Pi Gamma Mu, the Honor Society in Social Sciences, also recently invited to Alpha Kappa Delta, the International Honor Society of Psychology. He'll have lots of cords to wear across that stage, inside or outside, wherever it might be there. After graduation, David is interested in pursuing his PhD in psychology. Please join me in welcoming David.
Thank you very much. I'll be touching on the topic of touch and loneliness, specifically how touch interacts with loneliness perceptions among college students. Thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for the introduction. So to begin, I would like to start with a quote here. Man is by nature a social animal. An individual who is unsocial naturally and not accidentally is either beneath our notice or more than human. Society is something in nature that precedes the individual. Anyone who either cannot lead the common life or is so self-sufficient as to not need to and therefore does not partake of society is either a beast or a god, by Aristotle, as cited in Emerson 2002. And I wanted to start with that quote because it's demonstrating the fact that humans have, for a very long time, had an understanding that we are inherently social beings. And part of being social, as seen through the handshakes and the hugs that I've had today, and some of you as well, touch is a big part of that. And utilizing touch, you can also have a better understanding of human relationships, how to maintain them, and how to forge better ones. So some of the background information here by Von Moore and colleagues. This study looked at the effects of COVID-19 restrictions on psychological well-being and touch cravings through the use of an online survey. This online survey, it examined intimate, friendly, and professional touch experiences during restrictions of lockdowns. They had an N of 1,746, so a pretty sizable sample. And the results demonstrate the importance of touch during distress. As mentioned up here, intimate touch deprivation was associated with higher anxiety and greater feelings of loneliness. That was also, despite intimate touch being the most abundant type of touch available during these lockdowns. It was also the most craved. This was, of course, influenced by attachment styles. Those who were more anxiously attached had more craving. Those more avoidantly attached had less craving. This other Von Moore and colleagues study looked at specifically affective touch and discriminative touch. The difference here, to be explained in my preferred way, is when you give somebody a hug, the discriminative touch is the physical sensations, the physical pressure, the temperature, heat that you might be feeling, where the affective touch is the emotional meaning behind that hug. Affective touch typically is characterized by slow moving, light pressure, perceived as pleasant, and in social contexts, like when there's a hug, it is conveying emotion. This study specifically used the cyberball task with 84 different participants. The cyberball task is an online ball tossing game, so that to do this they had an inclusion and an exclusion condition with the cyberball task. The participants would first undergo the inclusion cyberball, which means they received the ball as many times as other virtual people in the game. They then took a need threat assessment to measure their social isolation. Then they underwent the cyberball exclusion condition, so they didn't receive as many ball tosses as in the inclusion condition. And then they took the need threat scale again. Now what this found was that the slow touch group reported less feelings of anxiety, or a less need threat scale than the ones who got affected. McKenna Plumley and colleagues did a qualitative analysis of feelings of loneliness experiences during COVID. This was done in the UK using semi-structured telephone and video conference interviews. This first point on loss of in-person interaction leading to loneliness. It was a common thing that they would try and use digital interactions to kind of supplement and make up for the lack of in-person interaction, and that was found to be completely insufficient, at least for the participants in the study. The second point on constrained freedoms, the restrictions, obviously limited social freedoms if you can't meet in large groups or meet in certain areas, and that was strained personal relationships as well as led to some feelings of frustration for the participants. Challenging emotions came into play during the fluctuations. The difficult emotions kind of coincided with loneliness. Very much not a pleasant time. And then their coping, they tried to utilize digital means of interaction, which, as I mentioned, was not sufficient. They also tried to use distraction and recreation, but during COVID, when there are restrictions, that can be, it was quite difficult for the participants. This third study by Twain and colleagues looked at in-person interaction in relation to social media use, and they linked that to loneliness. This was probably the most expansive study I looked at, going back to 1976 and finishing up data collection in 2017. To do that, they utilized the Monitor the Future survey, which was given to a lot of high schools and middle schools to collect a representative sample of U.S. adolescents and entering college students. So they finished with an N of 8.2 million. And the main findings here were pretty interesting. At the cohort level, there was a negative relationship between social media use and in-person social interaction, which means as a group, as social media use increased, in-person social interaction decreased. At the individual level, however, there was a positive correlation between social media use and in-person interaction, meaning the opposite, as as social media use increased, in-person interaction also increased. It is very important to note, though, that when you combine low in-person social interaction with high social media use, those are reported the highest feelings of loneliness. So I came away with a couple hypotheses after my review stuff. As one has more touch experiences, their subjective loneliness will decrease. The rationale behind this is, per the studies mentioned, there are positive effects to having touch experiences, and then a lack of that touch can also lead to negative effects. And I also hypothesize that living off campus will increase feelings of loneliness, not necessarily because you're off campus, but because when you live off campus, those students might not have as much of an opportunity to have in-person touch interaction, at least when compared to students living on campus. So my study utilized a survey, the recruitments in my study were all Wednesday college students of at least 19 years of age. If you were under that or not a Wednesday college student, you were not included. They were solicited for recruitment via an in-person address I gave you, utilizing a recruitment script that was IRB approved. This was read in front of classes after I had received instructor approval. I also gave those instructors a link to the survey so that in the future those participants who were willing and able could voluntarily take that and participate. Here we have a breakdown of the demographic information of all of my participants. There were 11 identified as male and 30 identified as female, so there was a little bit more female than male participants. 34 identified as white, 2 identified as Hispanic or Latino, 2 participants identified as multiracial or multi-ethnic, 1 participant identified as Black or African American, 1 participant identified as Middle Eastern or African, and 1 as other or self-described. Here you see the split between living on and off campus. This was pretty nice. It was a pretty even split. And then we have the student classifications here. And it is important important to note that all participants were treated in accordance to the APA guidelines, and that although we had 41 responses approved, due to missing data and incomplete survey submissions, we did have to exclude a couple from data analysis. Now for the actual design, we utilized a survey based on the UCLA Loneliness Inventory version 3. This is a validated pre-existing measure. It's been performed 3 times. And it's used to measure subjective feelings of loneliness and social isolation. Here were a couple of the questions that are on that survey. You can see it uses a Likert scale, 1 through 4. We also added demographic questions to get at the demographics, as well as questions regarding touch craving, recent touch experiences, and recent hug experiences. It was done completely online utilizing SurveyMonkey, which I admit has a great name, but it's a rather simple, free online survey software. So taking the survey, it was accessed via a hyperlink made available through Canvas, as I mentioned. I gave that to the willing instructors, and they provided that to their students via Canvas announcements. Prior to taking the survey, the participants were prompted with an informed consent form, which was IRB approved, and it detailed everything that necessarily needs to be in an IRB informed consent form: voluntary participation, and knowledge of what exactly they will be doing. After their informed consent form, and they verify their age, and they take the survey. The survey itself was about 29 questions, and it shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes to complete. At the end of the survey, after they submitted it, they would be prompted with a debriefing form, which included information on contacting student health and counseling resources in the event that that was necessary, given the subject matter of loneliness and social isolation. So the actual results of our survey. The minimum score that we received was 28, and the maximum score was 68, with a range of 40. It is important to note that a lower score indicates less loneliness. So the individual who scored a 28 feels much less lonely than the individual who scored a 68. In our data analysis, we looked at the loneliness scale score in relation to physical contact during the week. That is, the amount of physical contact has one has on a weekly basis. It was statistically significant with a p of 0.05. And basically what this is saying is that as the loneliness scale score increases, the amount of physical contact during the week decreases. So potentially less physical contact during the week indicates or would lead to more loneliness. We also looked at touch cravings, which were positively associated with physical contact during the week, and they were positively associated with hug frequency. So as one has more touch cravings, they have more contact during the week, and they have hugs more frequently during the week. This was a very interesting thing. Now, not to bombard you with numbers that might be very scary for some. Basically what this is showing here is that those with the least reported craving had the highest average loneliness scale score. So, craving touch, 1 is that they never crave touch, 5 is they're always craving touch with the range between them. We can see here the people who indicated never craving touch had the highest average loneliness scale score. Granted, it does have a small n, but that trend does appear as you go through each group of the touch cravings. More numbers, don't be alarmed, I've broken them down. This was just the SPSS printout. This is saying, and breaking down that previous printout here. We found that physical contact was negatively correlated with feeling alone, and, which means as physical contact increases, feelings of feeling alone decrease. Physical contact was negatively correlated with feeling no longer close to people. So as one has more physical contact, the feeling that they no longer feel close to people decreases. As one has more physical contact, the feeling that one cannot find companionship when wanted decreases. As one has more physical contact, the feeling that there are people who do not understand oneself decreases. As one has more physical contact, the feeling that there is no person one can talk to decreases. And as one has more physical contact, the feeling that there is no person one can turn to also decreases. And I'd like to focus on these questions because these are all aspects related to loneliness. They were all also statistically significant. And just as an interesting side note, these last 5 questions were all reverse scored, which provided some fun in coding and statistical analysis. So, what did we find from these results? Well, they seem to confirm the hypothesis that touch experiences have a negative relationship with loneliness perceptions. If I go back to the previous slide, as one has more physical contact, all of these aspects of loneliness also decrease. That seems to validate the hypothesis that as one has more physical contact or more physical contact experiences, they have less feelings of subjective loneliness, which is consistent with the literature that we found. There was no indication that living on or off campus had a role in loneliness scale scores. I'll mention the limitations that's possible due to a couple of different things. And then these last 2 aspects kind of go hand in hand. There was a trend in sex differences between the male and female respondents. However, there were almost double the female respondents, so that kind of indicate that as well. But looking through a bit more of a sociological lens, there is definitely social impacts regarding touch and masculinity, things of that nature. And then those with the least reported touch cravings had the highest average loneliness scale score, which myself, I did not expect to find that at all. I kind of thought that as one would have less touch cravings, would have a lower loneliness scale score, because the rationale being if you don't crave touch, you aren't going out to seek it because you get lonely, which was not, did not appear to be the case. It appeared that as people had more touch cravings, they actually went out and sought more physical contact, things of that nature. Now, I alluded to the limitations of this study. We had a relatively small number of participants in 38. Originally 41, but the missing data made us exclude a couple of surveys from the analysis portion. The duration of access to the survey was also approximately 2 weeks. This was because of time constraints during the semester and working through IRB, things of that nature. There was not a lot of diversity in the participants, which speaks to generalizability. There were mostly women, mostly female participants, and they were also white. So generalizability is a little bit iffy there. The survey only asked closed-ended questions. This is the con, I would say, to survey methods, in that you can't really get the why behind things without those closed-ended questions. And this was a bit of an oversight. There were no questions regarding social media use. I mentioned that study in the beginning that looked at social media use and in-person interactions. But on our survey, we actually did not account for that, which in the future could be very beneficial. With that, we have, as with our limitations, we have opportunities for future research. How affective touch interacts with loneliness perceptions was the second half of this project that I unfortunately was not able to complete due to time constraints and working through the IRB and things of that nature. This was originally an in-person section of this whole project, looking specifically at the role of affective touch in immediate loneliness perceptions. This experiment would have looked something along the lines of having 2 groups of individuals, of participants, one undergoing an affective touch condition, one a more neutral, fast, non-affective touch condition, and then utilizing the same UCLA loneliness scale score, loneliness scale, to see if there was any sort of impact as a result of affective touch. Furthermore, I think in the future, this topic provides a great opportunity for in-depth interviews utilizing open-ended questions and incorporating social media use. There was, I referenced some studies that did in-depth interviews as well as that incorporated social media use. I think in the future, this would be a great thing to add to a study on this topic to get more of the why behind these self-reports. That'd be, of course, very beneficial. And before I conclude, I have to say thank you to a couple people. Two of them are actually here. Dr. Dan Miller, our academic advisor, my honors advisor, and phenomenal professor, was very helpful during this process. Dr. Jenny Miller, no relation, who unfortunately could not be here today. She was very helpful in the statistical analysis portion of this project. Dr. Shelton, who is also a great professor and is the chair of our Wayne State IRB, he was very helpful in helping me with my IRB applications and getting me through that process. My two IRB reviewers, Valerie Knight and Rusty Ruth, who worked very diligently alongside myself to get those IRB forms revised, edited, and passed as quickly as could be. I would also like to give a shout out to my lovely girlfriend who made the drive up today. Very awesome human being. Can't say enough good things. And with that, here are the references. I would like to open the floor to any questions.
So I sort of came in late, so if you covered this at the beginning, I apologize. How are you defining touch in these situations?
So, physical contact, typically, we did make a distinction between types of touch. So, in the survey, we asked questions regarding physical contact was one of them, but also hugs. How often do you have hugs on a weekly basis? And I'm not sure if you were here when I mentioned differences between affective touch and discriminative touch.
I didn't, so I'm sorry.
Oh, you're perfectly fine. Discriminative touch is when you touch something, like this fun little clicker, the smoothness, the weight, the texture, things of that nature. The affective touch would be, it's typically slower paced, lighter pressure, and perceived as pleasant. And in social context, it conveys emotion. So my go-to example for that is a hug. When you hug somebody, the discriminative touch would be the physical contact of like their skin or the clothing, the warmth, the temperature warmth you might be feeling, and then the pressure. Whereas the affective touch part might that comes into play with the emotional feeling behind the hug.
Thank you.
Yes.
I think you've got potential for a lot more interesting research as you bring in social media. You know, if people who utilize social media are lonelier, are they seeking out social media more often because they were lonely to start with and are looking for some kind of contact, but find it unfulfilling because of the lack of touch? Or is it social media can potentially cause an addiction that leads to more loneliness if you are spending all your time staring at your phone? I don't know how you're going to design the surveys or the questions, but I think there are some unanswered questions there, trying to figure out which came first.
Oh, definitely. The study I alluded to in the beginning,
Yeah.
utilizing the school surveys with a super large N at 8.2 million.
Yeah.
They were able to kind of look at it longitudinally to see effects over time, which I think was very awesome to see, because back in 1976, we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have phone laptops. So I believe in that study they cited that 2011 there was a really sharp increase, and around that time that was when smartphones and things became super popular. So yeah, it is definitely an area for future researches.
Well, then kind of thinking about beyond like, so we're not in physical contact at all times when we're in a room with someone. So it had to be difficult to, like, for your participants probably, to think back to the last time they were actually physically touched, right? So I think that's interesting. That's just like a really interesting point of your pieces, and like when I'm in a room with you guys, right, it's much different than being in a room online where we have that divide, that gap, because there is like this lack of ability to see somebody in the 3 dimensions that existed. But yeah, it's a really fascinating thing you've been kind of thinking about here and picking apart.
Well,
I'm just putting that up.
How I kind of got introduced here to the idea of touch and loneliness, I came across the concept of touch starvation. I found a video online of someone talking about how they feel like starved for human contact. And she seemed like that, it made it seem like that was very much detriment to her well-being. So taking that a step further, at places where, college campuses where maybe, I know Wayne has a very large international student population where maybe those touch experiences aren't the most abundant, and it's already a stressful location, there definitely could possibly be some interplay there.
I wonder if the potential for touch becomes like almost as important. Like putting yourself in the position to potentially physically interact with somebody.
And I think that was kind of seen when we looked at the touch cravings.
Yeah.
We had our results indicated that those with the most craving actually had the most frequent touch experiences. So maybe those people who are craving a lot of touch are actually seeking out those touch experiences more than the people who aren't craving as much touch.
Well, I'll just add a couple of things. One, you're relatively small in, originally planned to administer this survey, or at least a recruitment pitch, campus-wide, but when you were prepared to do that, apparently Wayne State College Institution has a limited number of SurveyMonkey, campus-wide surveys that can be administered in a period of time, which we didn't know about. And so we were sorry, you can't do it. It's like, sure, we can maybe shoehorn in one more, but no. And Dr. Shelton certainly is going to look into that when it comes to the honors project to make sure students such as yourself, aren't somehow precluded from using that method, which would obviously increase the possibly, most likely increase the number of participants in your study.
With that, this survey portion was actually only half of what was originally planned. We had planned on performing that in-person experimental side in addition to this survey. That was under the impression that we'd be able to administer the survey, like you said, campus-wide to get ideally an end that was higher than 100, but due to reasons that wasn't possible.
But then bring a smaller, most likely group of subjects, participants into the laboratory where you yourself would either deliver the touch of 1 or 2 types, or maybe I think there was even a possible third no-touch control condition. That's where I ran into trouble with the IRB, with male student researcher, even if it's using an instrument of some sort on the forearm, the ethical concerns there ultimately led to saying, let's not go there. Now maybe given more time and consideration as to how we might work this out in a way that would not lead someone to think something nefarious was going on. But, so that was disappointing for you, but you went through the entire design process and submitting the IRB approval or application, and certainly that was a learning experience in and of itself too, even though it's not reflected in any way in the data here. The other thing in terms of social media, I know in large part you were driven by the UCLA loneliness scale, and of course that finished up in 1996, although it's still widely and more recently used too.
Yes.
And yet it's written, from that perspective in which social media certainly wasn't as large a part. And so using that as a primary sort of dependent variable, I guess, although adding something else certainly could have been.
Yeah, and despite the limitations of this study, I definitely think that this is an area for, especially on a college campus, very large amount of research that can be done, especially bringing in social media use. And you can even incorporate like extracurricular activities, the touch, team touching, things like that, or all playing sports and things like that.
It would have been fascinating to go back in time and do that same survey in fall of 2020. After people have been
Absolutely.
quarantining for 6 months.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to see how that might have changed the numbers.
Oh, yeah, and there were, I didn't want to focus solely on
Right.
COVID-19, although I know, touch experiences, and it wasn't too long ago.
Yeah.
They kind of go hand in hand. But I think as a result of COVID-19, there is a fair bit of research out there now regarding touch deprivation and kind of how that leads to, as the sources I cited mentioned, higher levels of anxiety and less psychological well-being.
You mentioned the term touch starvation. Have they adopted the term security, touch insecurity, in the way that we talk about food insecurity? I don't know if it'd be meaningful in that
I
context.
believe,
That's in play.
in doing my lit review and things like that, I think touch starvation is more of a colloquial term.
Gotcha.
I wasn't able to find that term specifically in peer-reviewed articles or anything of that nature. I think in the future, however, that very well might start to appear that way. I can definitely see a movement in that direction. There are no more questions. Thank you all very, very much for your time and attention.
I have a little something for David, but before